comes from Wei Fen Li. Wei Fen is a business anthropologist at Quantum, a human insights and design solutions company based in Singapore. Wei Fen trained in South Asian Studies, English Literature, and Anthropology, and has an MPhil from the National University of Singapore. Her paper is entitled The Semiotics of Smooth in China, where the digital meets the unconscious. Please welcome Wei Fen.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so I work as a cultural anthropologist, and I do a lot of cultural semiotics within a design solution company. So this is one case study that we have, and I thought it might be a bit interesting to sort of break everything up and do some brand application here. So I think this is, it sounds really strange, right? The semiotics of smooth in China. And I guess maybe it's kind of obvious what category we're talking about. Okay, so that's just a short example. I don't know how many people have seen this. It's a pretty popular a skit that went viral from Saturday Night Live, and they're obviously mocking a Pantene commercial and sort of making fun of that dichotomy between magic and complicated science. But I think what's interesting here is that if you saw some of the words that they use, the words like luscious and nice and glossy, this is really where the hair category is at, right? It's kind of a very cluttered category. They're very literal descriptors that are used when it comes to hair. And at the end of the day, this category is a bit complicated because even when we go to consumers, for example, the articulation of consumers tends to be limited by what the category is offering. So if you go to a young woman in China and you say, tell me what your good hair day feels like, she's going to say, oh, my hair was glossy, my hair was lush, my hair was smooth, my hair was silky. And that makes it a big problem for marketeers because then this category in China especially suffers from big code convergence where for this particular project, we worked with Leo Burnett, an advertising company, for a P&G hair care brand. And the brand challenge was that 7 years ago, they were the market leaders, and they had positioned themselves on this idea of smooth hair, and they really owned it. But across 7 years, what happened was that there was a bit of a flattening out, there was a bit of homogeneity. Everyone sort of went to this visual of straight, no kinks hair, and that became the visual signifier of smooth. Which becomes a problem if that's your brand position. So why I think the question was why did everyone converge on this idea of smooth, and why is it that it kind of flattened out to this one visual descriptor? If we look at the English definition of smooth, there are really three extensions here in texture, motion, and personality, like a smooth talker. But when we look at the word smooth in English, it kind of connotes this flat, even surface. It connotes a motion that has no interruption. And this really, when taken very literally into images, is what we see here, like all these local and international brands in China advertising for smooth hair and having this very specific, straight, chopstick-like hair that never kinks. And it really became a category cliche, and every communication on hair became something like this. It had to show smooth hair that's able to ease off any bends and curves. And just became really generic. So the brand challenge here was, first of all, to say, how can we break out of this? What branding inspiration can we get around smoothness in China? But more importantly, also, how can we break out of just representing smooth through a visual of hair? What are the other semiotic nuances of smooth that we can get to linguistically, but also in terms of looking at cultural ideologies, looking at frameworks, looking at the way people actually live in China. So I think this category challenge was inherently a cultural project and one of cultural semiotics. It is really about looking at lived environments and social rituals, ideological frameworks that contribute to the differences in the way the Chinese imagine smoothness as opposed to the English word smooth. And this, of course, follows Umberto Eco's thought that culture and signification are interdependent systems of knowledge. And we looked at this project through that lens, where we looked at a couple of different texts, cultural texts, that were both modern and traditional. So what we actually did here was to look at cultural signification across, historical and contemporary. So we did have the very traditional cultural inquiry where we looked at concepts of smoothness in Chinese culture through a linguistics perspective, through philosophy, through film and art perspectives. We also felt that it was really important to look at a more modern and contemporary aspect of this, both through ad semiotics as well as digital ethnography. So for advertising semiotics, here we looked at cross-category advertising that looked at concepts of smoothness, not just in the hair category, but really just breaking out from that. And here I think we really wanted to treat advertising communication as something that's culturally informed, especially local ads, and something that taps onto echoes, but also then actively contributes back and shapes to that Chinese imagination of smooth. For digital ethnography, what's great about this is that we work with a digital anthropology team, and we do a digital scan of the Chinese internet to see what people are actually talking about when they look at words and clusters around smooth. But going beyond the text, what we did was a very visual analysis of things people were uploading and chattering about when they looked at smooth. Here, I think what's interesting is really looking at that contemporary manifestation of not just dominant code, but also emerging conversations around smoothness in China. I think the three different methods really came together very nicely, because if we looked, for example, at only cultural inquiry, what we would have gotten is a very abstract notion of smoothness that would have remained in that region of abstraction and wouldn't have been tangible. If we looked only at ads, then we might have again been stuck within the world of brand language. And if we looked at digital ethnography, we would have been utterly confused, because we were getting all these weird pictures of, girls floating underwater and really strange things that you would not expect when you think of the idea of smooth. But putting all three together, we could start looking at patterns of convergence across, and to start making sense of the data from across a historical and contemporary perspective. So I think I wanted to just highlight that when we looked at the cultural grammar of smooth, when we looked at how the new medium of social media and Baidu shows Chinese thought around smoothness, and when we looked at the myths embedded in advertising around smooth, what we're trying to do is really come up with is sort of referencing Echo's idea of a specific semiotics, where we're saying that there is actually a specialized methodology and grammar to understand the semantic codes and systems around smooth in China. And similarly, we've used this same method to look at lots of other cultural abstractions in different societies. So it's been quite a useful way of bringing things, abstract things like that together. I think also what's interesting is looking at Michael Caesar's thinking around specific semiotics, and he says that there's a lot of potential for this to actually achieve the status of science in inverted commas, and saying that it actually has predictive power, which I think is really relevant when we're looking at applied semiotics and saying we can take this concept further, a brand can use this, and we can kind of predict that it's going to be culturally resonant with consumers. So bringing it all together. So I'll just give one example of one of the codes that we found that was really interesting in this space. So we look at the idea of smoothness in China, and I don't know how many people can read Mandarin, but these are the Chinese characters for the word smooth. The two main ones are Hua and Shun. And I mean, Chinese is very much a pictorial language, so you can just like sort of stare at it for a bit and see if it makes any sense. But what's interesting is that for those who know Mandarin, the Mandarin language is made up of glyphs, and each of these glyphs actually have either contain either abstract notions of an object or reference a certain concept. And if you look at these two words, Hua and Xin, both of them have a side of it which actually reference water. So we look at these three dots here, which in Mandarin is like literally san dian sui, which means 3 dots of water, and the other side of the word Shun, which actually references a river. So the question here is, how did water come to be related to this concept of smoothness in Mandarin? And when we spoke to Chinese philosophers and filmmakers who sort of specialize in Chinese philosophy, what we found was that Taoism is one of the key influences in Chinese thought, and it still continues to permeate Chinese culture today. And in Taoism, one very ideal way of living life is actually to embody the qualities of water, to actually, follow the natural flow of things by maneuvering around obstructions instead of fighting against it. And if you look at this excerpt from the Tao Te Ching, we see, one who lives in accordance with nature does not go against the way of things. He moves in harmony with the present moment, always knowing the truth of what must be done. So what this is really saying is the soft and yielding quality of water, which is its fluidity, is being celebrated as its strength. And this was a very interesting interpretation of smoothness as flow and harmony that we might not have expected from the Western notion of smooth. And I think what's also, maybe what people might recognize is that famous Bruce Lee quote about being like water. where he says you must be shapeless, formless, like water. And when you pour water into a cup, it becomes the cup. When you pour water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. And so, therefore, become like water, my friend. And this is really the origins of that thought in Taoism. So we take this cultural inquiry, we put it into our understanding of smooth. What becomes really obvious is that metaphysical understanding of smoothness in Chinese, which is about being frictionless and following a natural path, immediately puts on a different spin and a different paradigm when we look at the texture and motion, particularly of smooth. So where in English, when we think of smoothness, it's that flat and even surface, in Chinese, it's really about, it could be silky, it could be slippery. When we look at motion, especially in English, we think of a smooth journey, right? No interruptions. But in the Chinese, it just means effortless and unimpeded. So there could be obstacles, but it's really how you maneuver around it that matters. So what was great about this is that it gave us the starting point to start looking at the sensorials of smooth, not just in terms of visual hair, but in terms of what does smooth feel like, taste like, smell like, sound like. And then we combine this with the machine learning algorithm that we used on user-generated content in the Chinese internet, and also with the advertisements from cross-categories that looked at smooth. This is just a small spectrum of what we found, but what was really interesting was that we saw lots of elements like jade and pearl and water, which are all inherently very nurturing, very warm, also very visually, texturally smooth. And we also saw a lot of other sensorials embodied within these pictures, such as flowing water, breeze, rippling liquids. And all these audios, colors, and objects really led us to this higher cute meaning of harmony. I think what was also interesting was looking at mood changes. Some of the cross-category advertising was stuff we didn't expect at all. So we saw alcohol category, for example, showcasing balance and harmony and very elemental images. And let me show you an example. So this is one alcohol ad from China. And usually we associate the alcohol with, hard masculinity and things like that. But look at this.
甘醇和谐净爽，流之美，和之静，柔。
Yeah, so that was one example. And the other thing we found interesting was, if you look at this, it's a beverage, it's a milk tea advertisement. And in this ad, the girlfriend's really angry, but look at how he deals with it.
心情好，感觉什么都好。全新统一阿萨姆奶茶，给你顺滑好心情。
So, I mean, what it's saying is that, if you have that smooth frame of mind, if you're drinking smooth liquid, then even your perspective of a woman throwing things at you violently would become something very positive, and you would actually be able to go with the flow, right? He didn't get angry or anything, it was almost artistic the way she threw things at him. So bringing all that together, we came up with 10 different codes of smooth in China, all of which was framed by this perspective of frictionless and elemental flow. And unfortunately, I can't share any output because the campaign is actually going to launch at the end of this year in Q4 in China. But in anticipation of that, I think we just want to talk a little bit about the results of this. So I think the first big thing was that the clients really felt that it really changed the category dynamics for a brand that had, for the last 7 years, kept stressing on this visual of straight hair and felt very stuck. It was quite refreshing for them to find out that truly desired smooth hair could actually be seen as free-flowing smooth as opposed to straight chopstick hair. And this change of visualization really gave the brand a distinct meaning to the core benefit of smooth in the category. But besides visualizing, I think what was also very interesting was the sensorial aspect of it, and going beyond just visual hair, but saying, hey, there's actually a mood shift that you can enact. There are actually certain other cues in terms of sounds and landscape that you could tap onto to cue smooth. The second thing was that flexibly smooth hair really beautifully concurred with cultural values around soft power that Chinese millennials were also expressing. So we found that a lot of young millennials felt that what differentiated them in China compared to other millennials around the world was their ability to be flexible, which is literally that quality of being like water. So they felt that they were not fixated on their beliefs and attitudes, they're very pragmatic, And whenever there was a point of friction, they believed in coming around the problem rather than tackling it head on, which many people might know is a very Asian way of meeting confrontation. So this campaign really helped to connect the dots between consumer research and that semiotic world of what smooth means. And I think altogether it came together to create this inspiration in hair, which is what we have. Yeah, so that's all I have today.
Thanks, Wei Fen. That was really interesting seeing how a Western notion can be reinterpreted with really important cultural significance. I think we have time for one question. Because we've got held up a little bit by technology, I think we're just going to have one question for now. So, okay, go ahead.
Well, it's more a comment. I thought it was absolutely brilliant, the work done.
Thank you.
And I think this is what a lot of, we grapple with a lot of global brands when they try to localize, and how do you actually create local context and meaning in this. So this is just fabulous stuff.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, okay.